June 6, 1944, 5 a.m., Kreisig Battery on the rugged coast of Normandy. Through the cold mist, Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Amsen raised his Zeiss binoculars, hands steady despite the chill and tension. Time seemed suspended in the pre-dawn gloom as his eyes scanned the horizon. Instead of the familiar quiet waters of the English Channel, the supposed impenetrable barrier of Nazi Europe, there was an impossible sight unfurling. A vast sea of steel stretched endlessly, a tidal wave of Allied ships and landing craft that blurred together at the edges, casting elongated shadows on the restless waters. Behind him, the concrete fortifications of the Kreisig Battery were still cold, untouched by the cacophony to come. Yet in the silence, Amsen's mind raced through the grim realization. This was not a raid or a probing attack. This was something unprecedented. Entire industrial nations had pooled their resources, and now their collective might was steaming towards his shores. The Armada numbered nearly 7,000 vessels, a staggering fleet comprising warships, landing crafts, supply ships, and merchant vessels. The coordinated effort involved over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations, each tasked with a singular mission: breach Fortress Europe. His orders came swiftly at 5:52 a.m. The Czech-made 210mm Skoda cannons roared to life 3 minutes later, slicing through the morning mist with thunderous barrages aimed at the approaching invasion fleet. But it was like casting stones into an ocean. This moment wasn't just a military engagement. It was the shattering of illusions held by the German High Command that the Atlantic barrier would hold against an invasion of any scale. Below the roar of artillery, the silent truth echoed. The tide of war had changed, swelled by the mighty engines of Allied production. For Amsen and his men, this was the dawning of a new kind of warfare, industrialized, relentless, and overwhelming. As the invasion unfolded, German officers from Laros Guyong to Omaha Beach grappled with disbelief. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, at Army Group B headquarters, was among the few who sensed the true magnitude. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Field's bear at home for what his absence portended, had prepared for an attack, but not for the relentless storm of men, machines, and steel that surged forth under an Allied sky teeming with thousands of aircraft. The night of June 5th had drawn a curtain over an old war. The dawn of June 6th unveiled an industrial onslaught that would bury the once feared German war machine. The war for Germany was no longer a contest of valor and strategy alone. It was a battle against an overwhelming arithmetic of production, a numerical tide with the force to reshape the world. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the jagged cliffs of Normandy, the vast invasion fleet continued its relentless approach across the English Channel. Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Amsen's observation post at the Kreisig Battery was a front-row seat to a spectacle the likes of which humanity had never witnessed before. The dark outlines of nearly 7,000 ships stretched from horizon to horizon, a living, heaving armada that challenged the very imagination. This fleet was no mere gathering of vessels. It was the physical embodiment of Allied industrial might. It consisted of 1,213 warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a staggering 4,126 landing craft ready to storm the beaches. Supporting them were 736 ancillary craft and 864 merchant vessels packed with men, machines, and supplies. Over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations manned this seemingly endless armada, their collective effort the product of years of meticulous planning and a mighty industrial engine firing on all cylinders. Amsen's Skoda guns thundered their warnings, but the German defenders were witnessing the failure of pre-war assumptions. The English Channel, once thought of as a natural barrier, had turned into a steel highway, a corridor for an unstoppable tide. The sheer volume of ships made any defense across the water almost meaningless. For every destroyer his battery targeted, 100 more sailed onward. The battleships alone demonstrated the overwhelming power of modern naval artillery. The USS Texas, firing its 14-inch guns, unleashed 255 rounds in the first hour alone, each shell weighing over 1,400 pounds. In total, Allied naval forces fired roughly 130,000 tons of ordnance before the first soldier set foot on the beaches. This was a demonstration not just of firepower, but of American industrial mathematics, where a single battleship could unleash explosives greater than many German artillery regiments' entire reserves. Amid the thunderous bombardment, the fleet's protectors swept the skies and seas. Thousands of Allied aircraft had already established air supremacy, making any German response nearly impossible. Escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers worked tirelessly to protect the transports and landing craft, keeping the skies clear and the sea lanes open. To German eyes at the Crissack Battery and beyond, the advancing fleet was not merely an invasion force. It was a manifestation of a fundamental shift in warfare's nature. Here was a military campaign fueled by factories, assembly lines, and raw production power dwarfing anything the Axis could muster. It was a war where industrial capacity and operational scale would eclipse traditional skill, doctrine, and courage. Despite the fierce bombardment and the ferocity of the assault, the fleet pressed onward, impervious and purposeful. Each landing craft was a conveyor belt delivering men and machines to the deadly shores. Tanks, artillery, supplies, and troops poured out in a relentless tide that foreshadowed the inexorable advance inland. The German defenders could only bear witness to this staggering spectacle, a tidal wave of steel and fire propelled not by individual heroism, but by the colossal weight of a global industrial powerhouse that had stretched its might to the edges of the continent. For Amundsen and countless others, this was the moment the battle was truly lost, not in a firefight, but in the overwhelming arithmetic of production. The Allied fleet was not just a military formation, but a symbol of an industrialized future of war, where victory belonged to those who could outproduce and outlast. As the relentless advance of the Allied Armada closed the distance to the Normandy coast, the skies and seas erupted into a cataclysmic symphony of fire and steel. By 5:30 a.m., the long-awaited barrage commenced, the largest naval bombardment in history, heralding the beginning of the invasion that would change the course of the war. For Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Amundsen and other German defenders positioned along the Atlantic Wall, the thunder of artillery was both a signal and a shock. His battery, armed with 210mm Skoda cannons, was ordered to engage first the U.S. cruisers Tuscaloosa and Quincy and the battleship Nevada. Yet, the volleys from Amundsen's guns, though formidable, were but drops in an ocean of Allied firepower. Every shell he launched seemed to dissipate into the vast body of ships converging relentlessly. The American naval forces wielded battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and monitors to batter the shoreline defenses. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour, each shell weighing a staggering 1,400 pounds. This amount of explosive firepower equaled or exceeded many German artillery regiments' entire inventories. Overall, the fleet unleashed approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships, delivering about 130,000 tons of high explosives against the Atlantic Wall before even a single Allied boot touched the sand. The relentless pounding shattered fortifications, silenced machine guns, and shook the battered defenders into grim recognition of the adversary's massive industrial resource. Concurrently, Allied air power soared overhead. Thousands of planes filled the sky, flying more than 14,000 sorties in support of the landings. Their domination was absolute. In stark contrast, the Luftwaffe managed just over 300 sorties across France on that day. German pilots Isef Prill and Hinz Vodacek made a desperate yet futile sortie to strafe Sword Beach, only to be chased off by overwhelming Allied fighters. This encounter highlighted the collapse of German air power and underscored the Allies' dominance in the skies. Despite the deafening bombardment and overwhelming air assault, some German defenders still believed they could hold the beaches. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied commanding positions on cliffs and bunkers. The first waves of American infantry met with a storm of machine gun fire from interconnected resistance nests. In these early hours, 20-year-old Hinrich Seeau manned his MG-42 machine gun with deadly efficiency, firing over 12,000 rounds throughout the morning and decimating American ranks. Bodies of fallen soldiers clogged the surf, and the sands turned crimson under relentless fire. Yet, as devastating as this fighting was, it was not enough. The U.S. Navy destroyers learned swiftly from the chaos on the beaches. By approximately 8 a.m., ignoring mines and risk of grounding, ships like the USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt steamed dangerously close to shore, bringing their 5-inch guns to bear directly on German strongpoints at point-blank range. This naval gunfire, coordinated by forward observers, uprooted previously impregnable bunkers and shattered German resistance. The loss of the destroyer USS Corey, struck by naval mines, was a stark reminder of the dangers. But the fleet's willingness to sacrifice vessels as expendable tools further demonstrated American industrial resolve. Amundsen and his comrades watched their defensive positions crumble under a relentless barrage, naval and aerial power driving an industrial wedge that shattered their hopes for an enduring defense. The morning of June 6th witnessed not simply the beginning of a military assault, but the dawn of a new age of warfare, one where overwhelming firepower and production capacity rendered traditional defenses obsolete. The Atlantic Wall was no match for Allied industrial calculus. As the relentless roar of naval guns thundered over Normandy's coast, the skies prepared to unleash a different kind of storm, one of steel birds and thunderous engines, sweeping in to secure the heavens and pave the way for the invasion's success. The daybreak of June 6th saw the skies above Normandy filled with more than 14,000 Allied aircraft sorties, an unmatched display of air power ensuring total domination of the airspace. This overwhelming air force had been meticulously massed over weeks to establish air supremacy, crucial to preventing the feared intervention of the German Luftwaffe, which fielded no more than 300 operational aircraft in the entire region. Among these soaring warriors were the Douglas C-47 Skytrains, strange twin-propeller planes tasked with a perilous mission: to drop and deliver thousands of paratroopers deep behind enemy lines. Approximately 13,000 airborne troops from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into the early dawn fog, their objectives critical for the success of the invasion: securing key bridges, cutting German communications, and sowing chaos within the enemy's rear. From his beleaguered observation post, the German defenders witnessed paratroopers landing with a mix of shock and disbelief. Many had never seen such a vast airborne armada before, and the sudden appearance of enemy troops behind their lines added a layer of confusion and urgency to an already dire day. Major Isef Prill, leading one of the few Luftwaffe sorties that morning, attempted to counterattack Sword Beach in a daring but ill-fated effort, strafing briefly before being chased off by swarms of Allied fighters. His sortie symbolized the near impotence of the German air response against overwhelming numbers and superior technology. Air superiority was not just about controlling the skies. It crippled German defensive coordination. The constant presence of Allied bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes rendered any daylight movement risky or impossible. German commanders found themselves unable to respond adequately as their forces were pinned down or isolated. The airborne assaults disrupted German defensive networks, but they also suffered horrific casualties in the process. Scattered drops, navigational errors, and fierce enemy fire turned many landing zones into killing fields. Yet, the pronged airborne offensive succeeded in seizing crucial points, paving the way for the seaborne invasion forces struggling ashore. This spectacle of airborne and air superiority was a stark confirmation for German officers that the nature of war had irrevocably changed. They were no longer fighting conventional battles between evenly matched forces. They had become targets of a modern industrial war machine, capable of massing unprecedented firepower rapidly and precisely. As waves of paratroopers landed amidst chaos, and the fleet bore down under unrelenting naval fire, the German defenders were caught in a vice tightening with every passing minute. The skies belonged to the Allies. The seas were an endless highway of ships, and the land was about to receive an invasion force unmatched in history. This was war redefined, not just at the tactical level, but as a sweeping demonstration of industrial might translated into military dominance, a future where control of the skies became as vital as control of the ground. As the first light of dawn wove through the fog-laden forests and beaches of Normandy, the German High Command grappled with a fracture in coordination and understanding, a paralysis born of disbelief and deception that would doom the defenders before the first shot was truly fired. At Army Group B headquarters in Laros-Guyong, 50 miles from the coast, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, read reports that grew darker by the minute. Yet Rommel himself was absent, back in Germany marking his wife's birthday, convinced that the weather and other factors made a large-scale invasion impossible. This absence was emblematic of the fractured German command that day, caught between old assumptions and new realities. The German strategic miscalculations were rooted in the success of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign so cunning it convinced German intelligence that the true invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. As a result, many German reserves remained frozen away from the fighting zone, held in reserve to meet an assault that would never come. Within the German ranks, veteran commanders like General Der Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, understood that something enormous was unfolding. Yet even with his frontline experience hardened by years of brutal Eastern Front fighting, he could scarcely grasp the scale of the incoming avalanche. Man, material, and firepower that would soon rip through Normandy's defenses. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit near enough to mount a counterattack, was delayed in deployment by layers of command hesitation and Allied air superiority that pinned down movement during daylight hours. From Runville to Carentan, it took 3 agonizing hours for the division to advance 10 miles, reducing what should have been a decisive armored counterstroke into a procession of burning vehicles and lost opportunities. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger, tasked with naval defense advice to Rommel, had long pressed for greater coastal defenses, mines, obstacles, and artillery. Yet as he reflected later in his memoirs, the Germans had prepared to fight the last war, not the futuristic industrial conflict that had arrived. The entrenched Atlantic wall was formidable, but hopelessly outmatched by the relentless bombardments, air attacks, and the sheer volume of landing craft arriving off the coast. Throughout the nerves and confusion at command centers stretching from Paris to Berlin, reports clashed with partisan silence. The attack was no longer a distant threat, but a physical tidal wave rolling through stone and bunker alike. Attempts to coordinate reserves were stymied by Allied air supremacy that made any daylight mapping or troop movements a deadly gamble. The German command network, suffocated by overwhelming sensor, radio, and bomb fire, was unable to deliver timely or effective orders. Their centralized command system, once a strength, became a liability in a battlefield dominated by rapid Allied initiative and industrial logistics. Within hours, even staunch commanders recognized the hopelessness of their position. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, famously told his superiors, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" His brutal honesty led to his immediate dismissal, reflecting the deep rifts and despair permeating German command. Meanwhile, Hitler doggedly ordered fanatical resistance, banning any retreat and demanding every inch of ground be held. This futile resolve further strained depleted units and sealed the fate of countless defenders, fighting not just men, but the unforgiving machinery of modern war. The confusion at the helm and delayed, fragmented response ensured that German forces were swamped not just by the invading army, but by the momentum of Allied industrial power realized in overwhelming numbers of men, machines, and endless supplies. By 6:30 a.m., the first wave of American infantry surged onto Omaha Beach, their landing crafts splashing into the surf under a relentless hail of machine gun fire and artillery from well-fortified German positions. Here, the Atlantic Wall's shadow loomed darkest, and the fighting took on a savage, brutal character, etched forever into the memory of those who survived. Among the defenders was the 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened force that had prepared meticulously for the expected assault. They occupied commanding positions atop cliffs and in reinforced concrete bunkers, their interlocking fields of fire turning the narrow beaches into deadly funnels. German gunners like 20-year-old Heinrich Seeau manned their MG-42 machine guns with lethal precision, unleashing bursts of over 12,000 rounds in the morning's combat. As American soldiers flooded the shore, hundreds fell in waves, bodies floating in the churned surf, the sands turning red with blood. For a fleeting moment, the Atlantic Wall seemed poised to hold. The chaotic carnage, the staccato bursts of machine guns, and the chilling cries of battle created a tableau of desperate resistance. Yet the intensity of German firepower could not stop the tide of men and machines that relentlessly pressed forward. The turning point came around 8 a.m., when American destroyers, defying danger from mines and shallow waters, advanced to within 1,000 yards of the beach. Ships including the USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt brought their 5-inch guns to bear on individual German positions at point-blank range. This naval artillery, coordinated by forward observers, was devastating. Bunkers that had seemed impregnable moments before were shattered. Troops pinned down by fire found breathing space, and resistance nests crumbled under the concentrated assault. In a brutal testament to Allied industrial resolve, the destroyer USS Corey was lost to mines during this engagement, the only U.S. destroyer sinking on D-Day. But this single sacrifice was quickly overshadowed by the sheer number of ships ready to replace it. The resolve was clear. Vessels were tools, expendable assets in a relentless campaign, supplanted as swiftly as needed to ensure the invasion continued. On the sands, American forces fought with grim determination, drawing on bravery born of necessity. Forward elements struggled to establish footholds, sometimes under harrowing conditions, with men driven by duty and the hope of breaking the deadly grip of German fire. The air above remained controlled by Allied aircraft, preventing German reinforcements from moving freely and crippling their to counterattack effectively. This air and naval dominance were decisive factors, allowing the infantry to gradually overcome the deadly beach defenses, despite staggering losses. For the German defenders, Omaha Beach would become a symbol of both their strength and ultimate failure. The combined force of determined resistance and overwhelming Allied power demonstrated the tragic limits of courage in the face of industrial-scale warfare. The battle for Omaha left scars deeper than any single defeat. It was a battleground where traditional concepts of valor met the brutal mathematics of modern conflict. The image of bulldozers pushing aside shattered tanks to clear paths for supply trucks epitomized the relentlessness and mechanization that defined the Allied war effort. Omaha was not just a military victory. It was a declaration that the enormous tide of men, machines, and material pouring from the sea could not be halted. The fighting on the beaches was only the first phase of a larger war machine, one fueled not just by courage and tactics, but by the prodigious industrial might of the Allied nations. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German officers became deeply impressed, yet horrifyingly aware of the sheer scale and innovation in Allied engineering and logistics. This was a conflict where specialized vehicles and endless supplies turned battlefields into exhibition halls of industrial power. Landing crafts churning towards the shore were not indistinguishable boats. They were part of a finely tuned supply chain designed for unceasing reinforcement. The LCTs, landing craft tank, discharged Sherman tanks directly onto beaches where rough seas and fierce fire threatened to wash men and machines away. These tanks themselves were marvels of mass production, symbolizing American industrial output, with tens of thousands rolling off assembly lines monthly. Another engineering miracle was the LST, landing ship tank, a colossal craft measuring 328 feet long. These behemoths deliberately beached themselves to open massive bow doors and pour entire companies of tanks and vehicles onto the soil, pushing inland with astonishing speed. Alongside them swam amphibious trucks known as WWIIs, which kept the supply lines open by traversing both sea and land to deliver vital fuel, ammunition, and food directly to frontline troops. German observers, accustomed to rigid linear combat and traditional logistics, struggled to conceptualize and counter these flows of material. Where the defenders envisioned clinches and attritional fights slowly draining enemy strength, the Allies unleashed escalating waves of armored firepower and ceaseless supplies, negating exhaustion or attrition. The tactical utility of specialized vehicles further impressed German commanders. In response to inaccessible terrain and entrenched defenses, the British introduced Hobart's Funnies, modified tanks equipped to clear mines, lay temporary bridges, and breach heavily fortified bunkers with flamethrowers. These engineering solutions reduced casualties and boosted momentum, illustrating Allied warfighting adaptability backed by industrial resources. For German officers like SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, the overwhelming material superiority was demoralizing. He later reflected, "Our strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. The battlefield was no longer a question of individual valor or elite units. It had become a contest of assembly lines and supply chains." By nightfall on D-Day, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops, 20,000 vehicles, and 15,000 tons of supplies, numbers that dwarfed the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. While Germany could muster fewer than 500 operational tanks regionally, the Allies rolled ashore with thousands. This relentless logistical surge strained German defenses into collapse. Ships and landing crafts formed an endless conveyor belt, pouring an industrial flood across the beaches and pushing the front lines forward before defenders could react. The industrial calculus was clear. The side that could produce and deliver the most firepower, vehicles, and supplies held the decisive advantage. The Normandy campaign was a harbinger of this new era, where war was waged on the assembly line as much as any battlefield. The German officers who witnessed the arrival of Hobart's funnies and mounting waves of armored vehicles understood they faced not merely soldiers, but an industrial complex brought to life, a combat force born from factories, mass production, and a will backed by nearly limitless resources. As the battle for Normandy intensified, the German forces sought to mount effective counterattacks to stem the inexorable Allied advance. Central to these efforts was the 21st Panzer Division, the sole armored formation near enough to intervene decisively on D-Day. Despite its reputation and battle experience, the division's counterattack soon became a tragic illustration of the futility that beset German resistance in the face of overwhelming Allied industrial power. The division's advance was delayed by relentless Allied air superiority and naval gunfire. Moving just 10 miles from Runville, it took 3 critical hours, a delay born from repeated air attacks, confusion in command, and damaged supply lines. What ought to have been a swift and devastating armored thrust was reduced to a grinding, costly procession of burning tanks and scattered vehicles. When the surviving Panzer units finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they were met not only by infantry and artillery, but by the concentrated naval gunfire of warships positioned offshore. The HMS Warspite, stationed some 15 miles out at sea, targeted armored columns from afar, firing 15-inch shells capable of penetrating any tank the Germans could deploy. These naval guns transformed the battlefield, turning armor into easy prey and shattering the traditional German advantage in tank warfare. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later write in his memoirs about this overwhelming superiority. Their material dominance was such that our strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. The heavily armed and numerically superior Allied forces rendered German tactical skill and bravery impotent against the sheer weight of mechanized destruction. This narrative was echoed across the theater. The legendary Panzer divisions, once the spearhead of Germany's blitzkrieg and rapid conquests, found themselves paralyzed and attrited by constant airstrikes and artillery barrages. The 12th SS Panzer Division, among the best German units, entered Normandy with over 150 tanks and 20,000 men. After 6 weeks of devastating combat, it was reduced to a mere 300 men and no operational tanks. Industrial disparity was not just numbers. It meant maintaining momentum and replenishing losses swiftly. The Allies outproduced Germany in tanks by a factor of approximately 15-1. The monthly American tank production alone dwarfed entire German armored corps. Where the Germans lost tanks, the Americans could replace them quickly, continuously pressing the assault without pause. The German armored counterattack symbolized the breakdown of traditional warfare in Normandy. They weren't defeated simply by battlefield tactics or strategic missteps, but were overwhelmed by an industrial force that refused to be stopped or delayed for long. For German commanders and soldiers alike, the reality was harrowing. Every tank destroyed was more than a loss. It was a symbol of dwindling resources and mounting inevitability. In the face of this scale, even the best-trained troops could not match the relentless press of an enemy whose strength came not just from fighting men, but from the immense factories, workers, and logistical systems beneath them. The armored counterattacks, like the defenders themselves, vanished beneath an unstoppable avalanche of industrial warfare, signaling not just a defeat on the field, but a profound shift in how wars would be fought forever. As the initial bloodshed of the landings gave way to the grinding advance inland, the true scale of Allied industrial capacity and ingenuity became undeniable. The triumph of D-Day was not merely measured in conquered beaches or captured bunkers, but in the unprecedented logistical undertaking that sustained the assault and enabled the rapid buildup of men and materiel far beyond what traditional ports could handle. German reconnaissance aircraft captured images on June 7th, showing not just seized ports, but the construction of something extraordinary: the Mulberry harbors. These artificial ports, meticulously prefabricated in Britain, represented a new paradigm in military logistics. Comprising 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 ships deliberately sunk to serve as breakwaters, the Mulberries permitted the Allies to unload vast quantities of troops, vehicles, and supplies directly onto the beachhead. Where Germany had spent years fortifying the Atlantic Wall to defend critical port cities, the Allies simply negated the need for them. By creating their own harbors in the open sea, the invading forces bypassed German defenses and ensured a continuous flow of reinforcements and material, despite fierce opposition. Within 2 weeks of D-Day, the Mulberry harbors were operational at a remarkable pace, handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily, surpassing many operational French ports. This enormous throughput was essential to maintain the momentum of the invasion, proving that successful offensives depend as much on supply chains as on combat prowess. Across June and July 1944, the figures telling the story of Allied preparedness and industrial might boggled the imagination. Over 252,000 personnel, nearly 440,000 vehicles, and almost 400,000 tons of supplies had landed in Normandy by the end of August, the logistical equivalent of building an entire army and supply base from scratch, all while under enemy fire. The German 7th Army, tasked with defending this crucial region, was overwhelmed not just by superior numbers, but by a systemic collapse rooted in the industrial disparity. While the Allies could field and sustain massive armored formations, mechanized infantry, and artillery support, the Germans struggled to maintain fewer than 500 operational tanks and faced severe shortages of trucks essential for mobility. The Allies' mastery of logistics, combining innovation and industrial output, turned Normandy from a precarious foothold into a launching pad for the liberation of Western Europe. Specialized vehicles like WWIIs ensured supplies reached frontline units, even as infrastructure remained damaged or contested. This logistical accomplishment recalibrated the nature of warfare. No longer was victory only the domain of battlefield heroics or tactical genius, but of supply routes, assembly lines, and the ability to rapidly project and sustain force across hostile terrain. For German commanders watching the catastrophic unraveling of their defensive efforts, the sight of bulldozers clearing wrecked tanks to clear lanes for relentless supply trucks epitomized their strategic defeat. The battlefields of Normandy had become monuments, not just to soldierly sacrifice, but to industrial supremacy and logistical prowess. As the smoke cleared over the battle-scarred fields of Normandy, the surviving German officers faced a profound reckoning, not merely with defeat, but with the irreversible transformation of warfare itself. The campaigns of 1944 had unveiled a brutal truth. The modern battlefield was no longer shaped solely by courage or brilliant strategy, but by the unyielding calculus of industrial capacity. The German commanders who survived the maelstrom, among them figures like Hans Speidel and General de Infanterie Gunnar Blumentritt, gathered in private symposiums years later to reflect on the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Their keynote addresses would forever link the defeat in Normandy to the collapse of an economic and industrial system fundamentally unequal to its adversaries. "We counted divisions while they counted factories," Blumentritt would famously declare. For every platoon the German army could field, the Allies could muster armories and yards of assembly lines. The mathematic truth of defeat was clear. Germany was not beaten by a superior army, but by a superior industry. The psychological impact on German officers was staggering. Many who had grown up under the Nazi mythos of invincibility faced the shattering reality that American soldiers were neither weak nor spoiled, but emboldened by machines, radios, and endless ammunition. Suicide rates among officers rose sharply as they struggled not with courage, but with the collapse of their worldview. This transformation was more than numbers. It was a chasm in technology. Proximity fuses that turned anti-aircraft fire into lethal precision. Radar-directed naval bombardment sweeping inland miles from the shore. Amphibious vehicles solving logistical nightmares. And specialized tanks breaking tactical stalemates without massive bloodshed. Naval gunfire, delivered by battleships like HMS Rodney and USS Nevada, became a new kind of artillery. Bombshells rained down from the sea with devastating accuracy and reach, obliterating targets once considered safe. German artillery soon realized their futile counter-battery fire was ineffective against mobile, hard-hitting ships. By July 1944, daytime movement for German forces was often impossible. Allied air power, flying thousands of sorties daily under the tight control of forward observers, could strike targets within minutes, leaving German units trapped and destroyed before they could respond. The ultimate evidence of this industrial dominance was etched in statistical horrors. Over 240,000 German soldiers killed or wounded, 200,000 captured, vast numbers of tanks, artillery, and vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Entire divisions vanished in the grinding final battles of the Falaise Pocket. Units that had once conquered Europe were erased. For German officers like Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who fought in Italy, Normandy represented total industrial warfare, where the enemy's might was absolute and the old rules no longer applied. Here, a relatively equal war turned into an annihilation campaign powered by factories and mass production. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Omsen returned to his observation post at Krisk Battery, now an honored guest reflecting on a lifetime haunted by that dawn. His words echoed the lessons learned on those brutal beaches. The sea of ships I saw was not just an invasion fleet, but American industrial might made visible. We learned we were not fighting just soldiers, but factories, machines, and production lines on the move. That day marked the birth of a new kind of war, one where industrial capacity was the ultimate power. The German officers who bore witness to D-Day and the Normandy campaign left a legacy not just of military defeat, but of a paradigm shift. War was no longer a duel of weaponry and soldiers alone. It was an economic system clashing in steel and concrete, where the victor controlled the factories, the supply lines, and ultimately the fate of nations.